I've been asked to speak to you about the history of Pineview, which in some audiences would put them asleep. But for you, that's part of your history. It certainly was part of my history as a student in the Alpha class, as a parent, as a teacher in the district, serving on the district-wide committee about how to process identification of students, particularly young students from Pineview. Eventually as a director over all of the instructional program in the district, and finally as superintendent. So lots of history for me. Let me get that started Pineview, 1967 to 1971. And this was out of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which is interesting because that was focused on disadvantaged students. Ultimately, Title I schools, all of that funding came through that federal organization. So the grant was written by 3 individuals in the district, one of which was Jack Wolver, who happened to be a science teacher. He was at Riverview. He eventually was science supervisor for the district. And 2 others. I suspect one of the others, although I haven't been able to determine it through research, was John Kropp, who headed up federal programs in the district. And the superintendent, Guilford, Dr. Guilford, was very much interested in gifted education. And I can tell you, Pineview would not exist today without him, because he believed in it and he had to fight for it. So the grant was written and it was approved, but it has to go before the school board. First, I think we need to think about how did a school for gifted education start up with a federal grant that was focused on disadvantaged students. But you got to look at what was happening at that time. We're really talking about the period of the Cold War. There was a lot of concern in America that we might not be competitive. When I was in kindergarten on a military base, we didn't have active shooter drills. We had atomic bomb drills, of which the protocol was to get under your desk. So, a little curious, but it was approved. And I don't know if there were strings pulled or if it was just people reacting to the times wanting young people to be competitive in the future. But there were also other implications. Gifted education at that time, very little research had been done on it. The most you had was some offerings at the high school level for higher level students. At the elementary and what was then more the junior high, it was more pull-out, sporadic enrichment, and that was about the extent of it. So this was totally new territory to have a school devoted to gifted students. And so it was a challenge for the district in many ways to approve the grant. It had to be approved by the district. And because there were things happening that were of great challenge for this school district during this time. This was a time in 1967, Sarasota was under court order for integration. So 2 schools in North County had been closed, and students were bused in 2 central Sarasota schools. Teachers had to be reassigned also to central Sarasota schools. It was also a time when there was a statewide teacher strike. Now that cannot never happen again because they made a law that made that impossible to ever happen again, but it had a profound effect in the district. Lots of teachers walked out. Lots of substitutes were replaced with them, and it caused huge uproar with parents and students. There was a student walkout from Sarasota Junior High to Pillett, who he was superintendent at that time, office. There were student boycotts. So it was in that kind of environment that this grant was approved by the school district with some financial implications. Not a lot. This was a huge grant. There was $325,000 for the first 15 months. And then not as much money for the successive years of the grant, but still a considerable amount of money. It paid for most of the portables, it paid for staff, it paid for the principal, but it didn't pay for everything. Transportation, maintenance, those kinds of costs, land, had to be provided by the district. But they moved forward. So the planning year began. Planning year was supposed to be just 1 year, but it ended up being extended because there was so much to do. They had to basically build the whole facility, which wasn't easy because it wasn't just classroom portables, you had clinic portable, you had office portable, library portable. You also they didn't want to have the bathrooms just in a portable. So you had to build a standalone for the bathroom. All of that had to be done. They had to start identifying students, which is a really huge hurdle. Communicating to teachers, largely depended on teacher recommendations. So that's where they started. And then they had to kind of weed through some very minimal achievement tests. Sometimes they used achievement tests to correlate to a supposed IQ, but then they still generally had to give the WSGAR. So that process probably is what caused the planning year to be extended, so we had a mid-year start. They had to identify teachers. The first year there were 10 teachers. And these teachers, it wasn't for everyone. These were teachers that had multiple preps, multiple grade levels that they were expected to teach. And they had a lot of professional development, staff development. And this was a time where there was not curriculum standards or objectives that had to be taught. So that really was up to the teacher to define that. They also had to define what instructional materials they were going to be used. All of that had to occur in the planning year. And finally, though, mid-year came. So in 1969, January, the school opened. But mid-year, I will tell you, for any superintendent, they'll say, opening a new school mid-year is really hard. And that's when typically you'll just be moving an old school where you've rebuilt and you're just moving it to a new location. This was starting a new school. So you can see the disruption. First you had staff then that for the first half of the year were not able to begin working. So that was somewhat of an issue. But there was also an issue just in the coordination. All of a sudden you had new transportation. We had to work with Alta Vista to coordinate the lunch. All of that had to be done, and parents had to be informed. We were moving students mid-year into a new school. That was some disruption that occurred. So there was a transition, both for parents and for students, just the change from what they were experiencing in the regular public schools. Class size was much smaller than Pineview. Now that didn't stay that way, but for those beginning years, it was exceptionally small. Later on, that became an issue in the district, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So they had that transition, but finally things were opened, and it seemed to be working okay. But then the big decision came. In 1971, the grant was going to be over. And now it was up to the district to make the decision. Was Pineview going to continue or not? All of a sudden, what had been very little financial impact was going to have major impact. There was the requirement of the district to fund it entirely. What's interesting is you can understand that there were some administrators, school administrators, that were not liking the idea of Pineview. You're pulling our best out of our schools. And that's before accountability. That's why you don't see many Pineviews. You don't see any Pineviews in the state of Florida because they won't tolerate it. The other schools won't. They won't support it. This is where the superintendent had some power. But there was a parent group opposing it that was going to speak at the school board because the school board had to approve it. So it was on an agenda. And there were parents who said it wasn't fair. There was no proof that it had made a difference. There was even a group that had done a study that says that we have looked at the data. There's nothing that shows this is better for students. Now, there's some people contesting, did they really look at much data? There wasn't that many years that had been going on to have much data. Anyway, so that one school board meeting could have gone either way. We had parents on both sides speaking. And for a while, the Pineview parents weren't speaking. But eventually there was enough concern that here we started this school, we've got kids that haven't even graduated, if you're gonna make them go back to the regular school, for whatever reason, they approved it. And that could have gone, there's so many times in Pineview's history, it could have gone a different way. And it didn't, which is why it's here today. So then we get to the challenges of having a popular school. Because from the late 70s to the 80s, all the way up to the 90s, Pineview was becoming incredibly popular. People were moving here to have their children go to Pineview. It's interesting because there was another school where people were moving here to go to, and that was Oak Park, a school just for severely disabled students. So you had people across this country moving here to go, and it had international reputation as well. But that was creating a problem. We've only got so much space in those portables. Every year you have been adding a grade level, and there was only so much you could do in terms of offering alternative courses. There wasn't enough space. And so part of the dilemma for the district was, what do we do to kind of not make Pineview so popular? Because we cannot, because class size was already increasing, but a portable is only going to be able to hold so many students. So there were alternatives that were developed. They had cluster gifted schools, gifted classrooms at some schools, where it was multiple schools that they would bus the children to a grades 3, 4, 5 cluster gifted, because there was still fear for elementary parents to send their children to a school with junior high, middle school, and high school students. So we were trying to offer alternatives for those parents that would also relieve some of the congestion that we were seeing at Pineview. There were other things. They started very strict dates. You could not come into Pineview mid-year. Or you had to meet a deadline in terms of meeting all the requirements prior to entry, and after that, that door closed. I will tell you, as superintendent, there were high-level people that would call me begging to make an exception. And once that door would have been open, that would have been it. We were hard fast. If you didn't make the deadline, you had to wait another year, or you could go to one of the alternative programs. So there were also increases in terms of the achievement requirements, some of which were crazy. It had gotten so high. So there was frustration in terms of how do we offer what a real high school needs to offer particularly, but for any level, to all the students on this campus, which has a finite space. So there became the discussion, should we build a new school? And that was an interesting discussion. We were paying for transportation now. There had been a huge increase in South County students, taking that 45-minute, 50-minute ride all the way to Hatton Street and back. So there was a dilemma. How can we accommodate those South County students? There was even talk for a while of 2 Pineviews. Let's build one in South County and one in North County, which would have been way too expensive. That idea floated out there, but was very quickly put aside. Finally, there was land we had in mid-county that we could build. And in 1994, plans were made to build a new Pineview. It opened with portables. Now, these were portables. By that time, it had gone down to grade 2. And so that they had in the portables. When Pineview opened originally, they departmentalized all grade levels. But they discovered second graders, third graders didn't do that well, being totally departmentalized, having to go from teacher to teacher. They needed more stability in the same teacher. So the portables did provide that kind of environment for the second and third grade classes. Then we had the dilemmas that, as I was superintendent, had to deal with. And I could talk a long time about the craziness of state legislation where non-educators are making decisions to impact school districts. Some of it was okay. They had, all of a sudden there were curriculum standards defined, there was an accountability system, schools were graded. That was a challenge for Pineview because they taught in most classes a year above grade level. To the point we adopted, when you have to adopt materials on a state list or you can't use their textbook dollars. So when we adopted textbooks, we adopted one for everybody but Pineview. Then we adopted a textbook for that content area for Pineview. That was partially because when kids left Pineview, if Pineview was using the same instructional material, they would be placed in a grade repeated with the same instructional materials. So you had to have this dichotomy of two different adoptions. But you also had, the Pineview did very well, as you can imagine, with school grades. They had the high performance. But then they said, what we want to see is, we want to use growth of students to evaluate teachers, 50% of their evaluation, and tie it to pay. So, you can imagine the conversations. And initially, for the first few years, the idea was you were to make a test, not just one test, because you had to show growth. You had to show growth in every single subject area. So, it was absurd, craziness to think you could do that. And that we had the science or the skills to make 1 million tests for every single subject area and grade level. Anyway, the requirements eventually became a little bit more palatable. They used primarily what they were doing in reading, language arts, and math. But there was this awful conversation that was occurring from teachers, other teachers in the district, telling it's not fair, those Pineview teachers, they have it made, they're going to be able to be highly effective, they're going to get the money because they have the bright students. And then these teachers that might have students with disabilities felt like they were at a disadvantage. Well, the reality is, even for really bright kids, showing a year's growth every year is a challenge to keep that high level of performance. So I think over the years, that has somewhat calmed down, where they didn't see Pineview only have highly effective teachers, even though they have some great teachers. But it's just, when legislatures make laws that diminish the quality, it's not like, I always say, it's not like teachers are holding back their best stuff to see if they're going to get paid more. You know, that's not a teacher's heart that I have ever seen. Then they had the legislation that had the biggest impact on Pineview, and that was the class size reduction amendment. It set 5 class sizes at all schools in the core, all the core academic areas, and it was for K through 3, it was 18 students in a classroom. For 4 through 8, it was 22 students. In 9-12, 25 students. Well, Pineview's even with the new facility, they had a lot of students. And there was a dilemma, because if you don't make those averages in all those classrooms, the district lost money. They also had to write a plan how they were going to remedy it, but there was a financial penalty for not making that. So of course the school board did not want that to happen. But how do you control that? Particularly where you're identifying students and you don't know who's going to qualify, because by this time there was a very strict identification process. So you have one more student here, and all of a sudden you've exceeded that cap. It got so bad that they put in place that if we go over, because it all had to be determined by grade level of how many students they could accept, that if they started to go over, they'd have to go to a lottery. And if you can imagine parents going through a million hoops of identification to get their children identified and qualified, and then you'd have a lottery to determine if they were going to be accepted. Now, what is good is that that didn't happen. They were able to somewhat control it. We've always known there's been grade levels where you see a jump. And you can guess what those grade levels are. Primarily, it's the entry grade always had a large number. The other was because parents are so afraid of middle schools. And so you saw the jump at 6th grade and 7th grade. They didn't want their children to have to go to middle school. So you had to deal with those kind of jumps. But largely, we were able to work through that, and now it's kind of stabilized. Since then, we've built another wing on the Pineview campus, no more portables. But that's kind of how the history has gone in terms of my knowledge of it and dealing with some of those issues. And I guess, you know, I'm amazed at the uniqueness still of Pineview. There is not another in Florida freestanding public school for gifted students anywhere. It's not even in the southeastern part of the United States. You don't find it. And I'm telling you, you never will. Because in the climate of accountability, superintendents are not going to build a Pineview. So Pineview is 1 in a million. It almost wasn't here, but it made it. And I can tell you, and I think you would agree, it has made a huge difference in our lives. I would not be the person when I graduated. If I would have graduated from a regular public school at a time when it wasn't cool to be smart, and you didn't get that kind of peer acceptance to be the one that's getting the better grades. Pineview made a huge difference, and the one that I'll always be thankful for, and I think you will too. So thank you so much.